In the late 16th century, Scotland, more specifically North Berwick, saw the rise of witch trials that would implicate over 70 people, some of which belonged to the Scottish nobility. But witch trials in Scotland came about in quite a bizarre fashion when King James VI sailed to Denmark to marry Princess Anne. Upon their return to Scotland though, a devastating storm struck, and the king and his nobles were forced to take shelter at Norway until the storm had passed. But this storm was said to have been so malevolent and wicked that King James could not conceive that this was a result of nature, but instead had to have been the product of some witch's spell. It would set the king off on a mission to eradicate witchcraft from his land, where several so-called witches were arrested, tortured and killed. One such victim was John Fian. Dr. John Fian was a school teacher in Scotland, though outside of that we know little as to what he was like, nor even how old he may have been. Whether or not he was involved in a supposed witches' coven that caused the rampaging storm that burdened King James VI is not known, but we know he was made complicit in witchcraft and sorcery, thanks to a local maid named Geillis Duncan. Geillis Duncan, yet another witch who was said to possess some divine powers of healing, was sneaking off into the night, though her clandestine endeavours would not go unnoticed by her employer, David Seaton. Seaton demanded an explanation for her disappearances, but when she could not supply one, he had her tortured. She would go on to confess to being a witch, and would implicate many others, including John Fian, as being meddlers in the dark arts. But it's possible John Fian was on the road to getting caught out anyway. It's understood that at the school John taught at, he became acquainted with a young scholar who had a sister. He was said to have become infatuated with the boy's sister, to the point that he attempted to enchant her into falling in love with him. He asked the boy to extract the pubic hair from her, so that he might use it in his enchantment, but it didn't go according to plan. It turned out that the boy's mother was also a witch, and when she learned about John's intentions, she was repulsed. She gave her son cow's hair to give to John instead, knowing it would sabotage his spell, and so when John used it in his enchantment, he gained the affections of the cow instead. Later reports by local neighbours during his trial would claim that the cow would follow him everywhere. In any case, Geillis Duncan's account of him being one of the many witches would earn him the close examination by the authorities. Under their crushing presence and the likely possibility of being tortured for information, John confessed to being a sorcerer. His most striking account was that he had bewitched a man he didn't like into succumbing to fits of lunacy at least once a day, as a means to annoy him. There exists an account of John Fian presenting in front of King James, along with the man in question, where he demonstrated his powers. He caused the man to suffer a fit of painful hysterics, making him twist and contort in horribly impossible ways, before making him jump, sometimes high enough to touch the ceiling, and land without injury. This ordeal for the gentleman would go on for about an hour before the man collapsed, only to wake up a moment later with no recollection of the events, nor having sustained any physical wound. John Fian was trialled for being a sorcerer, where he obliged the court even more, sharing with them how he had made a pact with Satan in exchange for his powers. However, he also stated that he was remorseful for his ways and renounced Satan there and then. He was placed in a cell that night, but would promise to live a life of a Christian upon his release. But that night, John Fian claimed Satan had visited him in his cell, and that the devil had worn a black robe and wielded a white wand. John explained that the devil was displeased with his choice to turn his back on the occult, and that he demanded John to carry on with his sorcery, regardless of the promises that he had made in court. But John testified that he told Satan to his face that he would no longer live a life of sin, and that he was done using magic. In his rage, the devil snapped the white wand, and exclaimed that one way or another, John would be his, before he vanished into the dark. So compelled by John's story, the court seemed to agree to give him a second chance, but during the night, John did something strange. He was still held captive for the time being, but despite gaining the court's favour, he he was able to steal a key to his cell and escape. When he was captured shortly afterwards, he was tortured. Like you, I also wonder why John didn't just stay put and continue with his account. Whether he was lying about becoming a Christian or not is not necessarily relevant, but it appears under this guise he would have certainly been let free. So why did he try and escape? It only made it seem like he was not capable of living under the falsehood of being a Christian, and more importantly, it made him seem guilty of what he was being accused of. Perhaps John became paranoid that he wouldn't be let go after all, and that his only means of escaping the judgment of the court was to physically escape it himself. Or maybe Satan appeared to him again that night and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I guess we'll never know. When he was recaptured, he wasn't given the opportunity to spin any more tales. The authorities weren't messing around with him any longer. They wanted a confession from him that he was a sorcerer and that he had no intention of reforming. His torture is one of the most graphic displays of human mutilation that's been covered on the Occult series so far, where his fingernails were forcibly extracted. Iron pins were then stabbed through the raw space of where his nails were, before his feet were crushed and rendered so small that he could no longer walk on them. All this took place, and yet John Fian, amazingly, did not confess. In fact, accounts have it that John Fian endured his torture without any expression of pain at all. There are those that believe that John Fian had indeed reconciled with the devil, and that the devil had made him immune to pain. Either way, John Fian's tale ends when he was eventually stuffed into a cart, strangled by a rope, and then burnt. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. Until the next time guys.